All right, like I said, we're going to jump into the actual analysis of the chapters of James Joyce's Ulysses today after a couple additional propedeutic remarks about it. One thing that I neglected to mention about our second protagonist, our deuteragonist, Leopold Bloom, last time when I talked about the things that these characters carry. I mentioned that his son, Rudy, had died around 10 years ago. I mentioned that his wife, Molly, is bent on cheating on him this day, and he knows for a fact this is going to happen. This is not, however, the final thing on his mind. Something else that happened longer ago is that his father, Virag, who himself immigrated to Ireland, married his mother, converted from the religion of his fathers in order to do so, he committed suicide. And very sadly, and very similar to the Odyssey, you may know that in the Odyssey, there's a poignant scene between Odysseus in disguise and his dog Argos. He sees his dog Argos while in disguise, who is ruined after having been a very fine hunting dog. Think about how much effort people put into a dog, especially a dog that they train in order to fulfill a function. And even though he is in disguise, even though he has returned 20 years later, Argos lifts his muzzle, wags his tail, suggesting that he recognizes his master. He then dies. And Odysseus cannot show any compassion for the dog that he partially raised, but then left for the majority of its life, because that would give away his disguise. When Virag dies, he leaves a note for Bloom. Bloom keeps this note. We see this note at one point. We don't get to read the entirety of it, but Bloom finds it in this just drawer full of things. Do you all have some drawer full of things, or have you had a drawer full of like a yo-yo, a pin, a pad, like 2 or 3 paper clips, something like that? He keeps the note around. And in the note, Virag says, my last request is that you take care of my dog, Athos. So also a Greek term. And so adding to the sympathy that we feel for his character, but also adding to the complexity of Leopold Bloom. In this day, he will think over and over again about his dead son, about his dead father, about the fact that his wife is going to cheat on him, not simply because he ruminates on it, but because he's reminded by everything around him, the people around him. I mentioned also his Jewish ethnicity. This will be brought up in terms, in order to show that he is an outsider over and over again. Particularly in Hades, we see a couple of these things happen. Chapter 6, when he's in the buggy going to put his friend Paddy Dignam, a representation himself of the drunken Elpenor and Odysseus and the Odyssey, to rest. There will be a Jewish moneylender that they walk by who has a crook back. And several of the Irish lads, Mr. Power, Mr. Cunningham, Mr. Daedalus, the father of Stephen Daedalus, will crack jokes about him. In fact, Stephen Daedalus's dad is actually a very good mimic and very funny. People consider him very funny, great singer as well, very talented guy who, in the eyes of his comrades, has not made much of himself, Leopold Bloom included. But he makes a comment about everybody has gone to that man at one point or another. And then there's a look over at Bloom. Well, almost everybody. There's also a comment in the carriage that suicide is the coward's way out. Very, very sort of orthodox, conservative Catholic perspective. And Mr. Cunningham, himself knowing Bloom well, feels sort of awkward knowing that Bloom's father committed suicide and says, well, temporary insanity. So there are reminders, just in the casual comments that people make, that continually remind, that bring to mind Bloom's difference in the things that he carries. And something I hypothesize that James Joyce is attempting to show you is how you work as a human. That you as a person already carry things with yourself. You have new things happen, but in some ways, Ecclesiastes, Solomon is right. There's no new thing under the sun. That the tragedies that occur in your life, and there are plenty of people that talk about somatic tragedy and trauma these days, and how trauma is actually embodied, does things to your nervous system, your heart, and even to your size of certain parts of your brain. That there's no getting away from the ghosts that haunt you. And so, perhaps that will give you an ethical imperative. If there's no getting away from the things that are a part of you, this is to some extent what Hamlet's story is about. He's a universal genius, yet he finds himself in a family drama that's very specific to him. And ultimately, if you look at the ending, and soon you'll have the opportunity to do that, There really was no way out for him. And so each one of these characters, I want to tie them to Don Quixote. One of the big problems of Don Quixote is differing of perception. Whose perception is correct? Sancho's, a realist, those are windmills. Or Don Quixote, those are giants. In this text, it doesn't seem quite as dynamic. Bloom, Stephen, and Molly, none of them seem insane, out of their minds, and yet they all see things very, very differently from each other. And so something I want you to start thinking is, maybe Don Quixote was a little bit hyperbolic, overdid it a little bit, showed that people's perspectives can be very different in a really extreme way, but maybe it was onto something. Maybe this world is sort of insane because everybody in it sees a little bit, what? Differently. But then what could we do with each other as humans? What would we have to do with each other if we wanted to figure out what was going wrong or going on, not just in our own heads? We'd have to communicate with each other. That's right. We'd absolutely have to communicate. You might consider that one of the major reasons for writing a book. There seems to be something or many somethings that James Joyce is trying to convey to us through this extremely difficult, I would say, very much like an overgrown forest world. And you asked me, what do you mean by overgrown forest work? Well, you've all done a little bit of reading of this text, and so insofar as I expect, you are past, you should be, I think, in chapters 11, 12, 13 by now, but certainly past chapter 2, you will have started to experience the difficulty of this text. You are not alone. I made some bold claims at the beginning of this text that it measures you, like the great maxim, man is the measure of all things. Ulysses is the measure of perhaps not literary talent, but where you happen to be in your literary journey at some point. That said, I'm going to pull back from that claim because there's some highly literary individuals that really could not do very much with this text. So insofar as you get something from it, insofar as you take something of value from it, you will have done something that many great writers and great readers from the 20th century were incapable of doing. I exhort you to do better than your predecessors. And so one character that I mentioned to you before, the great analytical psychologist, Carl Jung, himself, sort of a student of Sigmund Freud, but he started his own school of psychology, says this about Ulysses. Dear sir, and this is this is straight to James Joyce. Your Ulysses has presented the world such an upsetting psychological problem that repeatedly I've been called in as a supposed authority on psychological matters. Ulysses proved to be an exceedingly hard nut, and it has forced my mind not only to most unusual efforts, also to rather extravagant peregrinations, travels, like peregrine travels farthest and perhaps fastest of travels. Speaking from the standpoint of a scientist, your book as a whole has given me no end of trouble. And I was brooding over it for about 3 years. What did we get? 4 weeks. Until I succeeded to put myself into it. But I must tell you that I am profoundly grateful to yourself as well for your gigantic, or as well as to your gigantic focus. Because I learned a great deal from it. I shall probably never be quite sure whether I did enjoy it. Because it meant too much grinding of nerves and of gray matter. I also don't know whether you will enjoy what I've written about Ulysses. He wrote a very famous critique of it. It's in his collected works now. Because I couldn't help telling the world how much I was bored, how I grumbled, how I cursed, and how I admired. It's a nice little rhetorical touch there. Shift at the end. The sting in the tip, as it were. The 40 pages of nonstop run at the end is a string of veritable psychological pages, with Molly speaks. I suppose the devil's grandmother knows so much about the real psychology of the woman I didn't. Famously, and this is perhaps an apocryphal story, Nora Barnacle, the wife of James Joyce, supposedly heard this read out loud, and the comment that she made immediately after hearing that Jung had thought that James Joyce knew so much about feminine psychology, the woman, she said something, this is a paraphrase, but very close. He really thinks that Jim knows nothing about women. It's very like Jon Snow, you know nothing about women. And well, I just try to recommend my little essay to you as an amusing attempt of a perfect stranger that went astray in the labyrinth of your Ulysses, happened to get out of it again by sheer good luck. At all events, you may gather from my article what Ulysses has done to a supposedly balanced psychologist. Boom. I have one more slide on this, I think. Okay. Who are some other major writers? Colm Toibin, Nora Barnacle, his wife, T.S. Eliot, Vladimir Nabokov, George Orwell. What do they have to say about this? It takes time and commitment to read Ulysses. That's about it. But anybody, and it's very rewarding if you give it those. The Dead, anybody can read it. That's true. The Dead is a short story about Christmas. Highly recommend you read it. I think I said that last class for the one or two before that. Nora Barnacle. I guess the man's a genius, but what a dirty mind he has, hasn't he? This is something that you will see during the course of this text as there is not an increase, but certainly a function on bodily, there is a focus on bodily functions in this text. There is a level of realism in this text, psychologically and physically, that we do not often observe in books. Remember Don Quixote. Part of the problem with Don Quixote's fictional characters is that he did not take account of certain physical necessities, like taking money alongside him. The fact that when he fights, he might be injured. He didn't eat very much. He didn't want to sleep. And so in this text, even more modernist, truly modernist, these very real items and emotions and moments of one's day do occur. One sees a note, has a thought, and remembers something from the past, and then feels very present feelings because of this. This perhaps happens to you every time you read. When you probably feel the same as I do. And tell me if you don't, because maybe I'm very quixotic. Because I'm kind of having made a Faustian bargain with the books. But you kind of sit down, you like reading it first. You don't really absorb it. You kind of go back and you start to read. But then you really know you've started to read. Either A, when you start listening to the narrator's voice, you actually start to hear a voice or the voices of the characters. But the other way is that you start to make associations of ideas. You read something and boom, you think about your mom. Or you think about, oh, my friend is kind of similar to this. And then you start to have your own thoughts. Ralph Waldo Emerson and I will say to you, that's the good part of reading. Absorbing the information in front of you is important and good. Using what's in front of you to get you thinking, to have your own thoughts, to make your own associations is really what it's all about. This is why you need a sacred space for reading. And by sacred, I don't mean anything, beyond sacred, but you need somewhere where you can focus and not be distracted, and somewhere where you can be treated as if your focus is important. You understand the importance there. You're reading in like a coffee shop, people are talking, they don't care that you're reading. You need to be somewhere where reading, like at a gym. You're working out outside, there are people all around you. It's kind of awkward. You're at a gym, that's the thing to do. And so find places that help you to get into the moment. You're martial arts, go to a martial arts studio. You're a gym person, or you want to work out, go to a gym. Go to the places that support the activity. It makes a huge difference, not a small difference. In fact, this is me bird walking just a little bit right here. This is an old idea. It comes from Latin phrase called genius loci, which means the spirit of the place. A place seems to have a spirit. So some places, you have certainly found this out, good for study, some places terrible for study. And as much as you try and will yourself to study better, some places are better than others, or this or that. All right, T.S. Eliot, he single-handedly killed the 19th century. Vladimir Nabokov, big critic of some great books. Yes?
What do you like to read?
That's an excellent question. I like coffee shops. I like coffee shops with noise-canceling headphones. Essential combination. I like to be around people, don't like to hear what they're saying. If there are enough people around that there's white noise, good. There's only one conversation near me. I start to really resent these people and what they're talking, particularly if they're loud talks. I know I'm loud. I talk to people in public, I talk to them. I don't talk to everybody, because what I have to say is not important to everybody. It might not even be important to the person I'm speaking to. And so, that's the sort of trust I have to give to somebody. That is something that never changes, by the way. You all can you could be Elon Musk, you could be the president, you could be the most important person around, and people will still treat you like what you have to say is not very important. So particularly family and friends. So keep that in mind. You'll never get by that no matter how much you achieve, but do achieve a lot. All right, Nabokov, himself critical of Don Quixote, and many scholars I know think Nabokov, excellent writer. He wrote Lolita, of course, a very strange tale about a man falling in love with a pretty-good-looking girl, and going all the way with the relationship. Great literary author, okay literary scholar. Often it's the other way around. We scholars try and get into writing, and we write sort of wooden, not very good text, sort of like the Aeneas version of Don Quixote. In any case, Ulysses, of course, is a divine work of art, and will live on despite the academic non-entities, like people like me, who turn it into a collection of symbols or Greek myths. I once gave a student a C- or perhaps a D+. You don't need to worry about me doing the same thing. Just for applying to its chapters the titles borrowed from Homer, we'll talk about in one moment, while not even noticing the comings and the goings of the man in the brown Macintosh. Did any of you notice him in Hades? That he's mentioned. There's a man with the Macintosh, and then the character who is writing down the names for the newspaper of the people who attended the funeral writes down Macintosh, which Bloom later sees, as if the character's name is Macintosh. He was wearing a Macintosh. And then Bloom's name is misspelled by his own colleague, L. Boone, who doesn't know his name. It's another moment of estrangement, right? This person who should at least know his name. Oh, and to add to the estrangement, what does he ask? When he asks Leopold for his first name, what name does he ask? He asks him for his Christian name. Bloom is technically Christian, but he's also not. And so each of those subtle moments are subtle moments that evoke the difference between him and those around him. And they add up during the course of the day. And he will eventually encounter a very cyclopic sort of figure who is blind drunk, who will throw a biscuit box, a cookie box, at him because of his his difference, but also his Judaism and his seeming lack of Irish nationalism. So Bloom will himself say, I am Irish. He self-identifies as an Irish person. It is those around him that identify him as different. It is not himself that takes on that. So Ulysses, of course, is divine work. Okay, got to that Homer brown Macintosh. He didn't even know who the man in the brown Macintosh was. I wouldn't expect you to get that until your third or fourth reading of Ulysses. Oh yes, let people compare me to Joyce by all means, but my English is catball to Joyce's champion game. All right. Well, I just include some of these details to show you that Joyce has been a confusing, brilliant, illuminating, and challenging figure to many powerful minds throughout the last 100 years or so. We did just experience the centenary, I think 2 years ago. Yes, 1922 is when this text was first published. And so it's been a long time to get it right, get it wrong. These next few slides, I show in greater and smaller detail the outline of this text. This is a really good one. It shows you the titles that were later added by Joyce to the chapters. They were originally untitled. This is similar to John Milton when he put out the second edition of his Paradise Lost, and he added in chapter summaries at the beginning. Sometimes those are the only bits of John Milton that students read. And he gave them names from the Odyssey: Telemachus, Nestor, Proteus, Calypso, Lode, Cedars, Hades, Aeolus, Lystragonian, Scylla and Charybdis, Wandering Mars, Sirens, Cyclops, Nausicaa, etc. Scene where these places happen: the Tower, the School, the Strand. Oh, they happen at, notice this gap between Cyclops and the biscuit box that's thrown at the bar at Bloom. Where these places born? You see this gap? Can anybody read this? I know it's not very good resolution. Can we? Can we not? It says 5 p.m. So it's 8 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m., 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8. Conspicuous gap there. We know what happens during that gap with Molly. What happens with Bloom? We don't get to see it. You might imagine that he's really, really feeling what he feels in those moments. And then we pick him up again at Nausicaa, where he deals with his emotions in what we might consider an extremely vulgar way. That's when he commits the the onanism, not mastication like rumination, but the word with which mastication rhymes that we often think about in association with it. That is something that he actually does during the course of this book that James Joyce includes into it that many have considered something of a lowbrow or even pornographic elements in it. But one might want to consider the purpose of why this man is included doing this foul thing in this text. Is it to exonerate him? Is it to make this seem like a noble act? No, he is very much like a defeated character in this moment. He's emphasizing his defeat and his turn from reality into imagination, right? I mean, to commit an act of onanism is itself a very pale reflection of what his wife had just done with Blaze's boiler. So perhaps that will help us to turn our attention to what Bloom ought to use his energy better doing, trying to make a return to his wife and to have a whole relationship with her, rather than them both seeking alternative substitutes. Himself, an image of a young lady, herself, an image of a strapping, young, dapper Irishman with a straw hat. I encourage you to return to this structure, to remember that this text is highly structured, even though it is like the overrun forest that I have mentioned. There are also, so not only are there 18 chapters, there are 3 sections, and they are marked by Roman numerals, 1, 2, and 3. Interestingly, the first Roman numeral, what follows is the telemachia. It's italics right here. The telemachia focuses on the Telemachus figure, Stephen Daedalus, who himself has a Greek-oriented name, right? Daedalus was the architect of the labyrinth at Crete, or Minos, father of the Minotaur. It was put at the middle of the labyrinth that eventually Theseus, hero of Athens, would have to defeat with the help of the son of Minos, or daughter of Minos, Ariadne. Daedalus is also known, very sadly, for having the son Icarus. When he attempts to escape from Crete with wax on his back and feather wings, he and his son are flying over the ocean, Mediterranean, almost surely in this case, and the son is reminded constantly, don't go too close to the sun, don't go too close to the sun. He does go too close to the sun, and he falls to his death. Very sad story. Very good way to expose young people to the notion of death, that mythological story. But I mention all of this because the Telemachia features the sole perspective of Stephen. The next section, obviously the longest by far from chapters 4 through 15, features the perspective of Leopold Bloom, but also of Stephen Daedalus. Their focus or their personality, their perspective, there we are, will shift. Certain chapters will focus on Bloom, certain on Stephen. Bloom will in fact see Stephen multiple times as well and comment on his boots. He's wearing Buck Mulligan's nice boots at this point. Going, because he doesn't himself have nice boots, because he's very impoverished, like his family. But even in certain chapters, their perspective will shift, like in chapter 7 at the newspaper room. So it is a mixture of their perspectives. The third part, 3, nostos, which means homecoming in Greek, it's where we get the word nostalgia from, which means home. We would say something like sickness, but algia means like pain, like neuralgia, like neural pain. And so like home pain is what nostalgia means. Yeah, perhaps some of you are feeling some of that. I know we got a Midwesterner over here, right? And so you probably feel that. There are probably things that happen during the course of the day that remind you of home and that make you feel a sort of poignant feeling of absence, right? And, you might say, Mr. Schmidt, you're a little bit older than we are. I might not have been through as much as you. Certainly true. You can go through a lot. There are a lot of people who go through a lot as young people. You might say, do you feel like you carry, more and more with you as you go through days? And I would say, yeah, of course. I never know what I'm going to think about during the course of the day. I have the things that I focus on, of course, but it's like, I might see some gray chair and start thinking about something interesting. You know that meme with the gray guy's face that's always around? He gets angry when he says, do you all know memes? And you probably know them much better I do. The gray-faced guy who, like, you say something to and then his face changes because he's angry because you got one over on him. I don't know. I look at a lot of combative. You can tell I'm a combative intellectual individual. I like seeing things where people get something over on someone else. Yes, you had a question. I'm not going to tell you, but older than you are. Older than you are. I'm to the age where I don't tell my age anymore. And there are good reasons for that too, and I can explain that to you. You're probably at the age where you don't like to tell people your age because then they're like, you're too young. Your perspective's undeveloped. I should teach you something. One thing I'll tell you, and take this as a hypothesis, as you age, once you are to where you want to be now, adult status, people will stop giving you advice every time they see you. That's something I bet you want more than anything now, because almost everybody you meet who's not your age tries to tell you about life, tries to tell you something. That is awesome. I know it's all you've ever known, but absorb as much as you can, because it's like a light turning on. All of a sudden, people just treat you as what you are. So it's interesting because you forget what you are, because people know it, so they're not trying to edit you so that you can become a better version of it. So I highly encourage you to take that edit you. And there are people that are wrong in their perceptions of you, so you have to understand that. But enjoy it while it lasts, as it were. Okay, Ulysses is structure and its protagonist. Ulysses is broken into 18 chapters, which are themselves broken into 3 parts: the Telemachia, chapters 1 and 3, Odyssey, chapters 14 and 15, Nostos, chapters 16 and 18. Nostos is the return home. Something to keep in mind is the home for Leopold Bloom. He's been cheated on. The marriage contract has been betrayed, obviated. Is the place where he stays at night still home? If his relationship with Molly has been dissolved. Stephen Daedalus accompanies Bloom home, wildly drunk. Bloom takes him out of a tough situation at a house of ill repute, full of hookers who are trying to not steal his money, but to take his money through guile. Bella Cohn, we'll get to her eventually. And Bloom takes it upon himself to sober Stephen up, to make sure that he gets to interestingly, he takes Stephen to his home. They have a wonderful conversation, chapter 17, which we don't get to see narrated. It's very sad, because we realize that we experienced the last time Bloom and Stephen speak without knowing it. And so we're denied their voices for the rest of the text. We're not there yet, but that is sort of a sad feeling. But then Stephen leaves. Stephen doesn't have the key to his tower. He's given it to Buck Mulligan at the beginning of the text, which we'll talk about in just a second here. And so, to what extent is the Nostos, the homecoming, the actual home? Is Bloom returning home? There's a great quote: "Can you ever go home again?" And often I really like to talk to college students. Is going home as a college student the same as living at home as a high school student? Is it the same place? Is the power structure even the same? Like, do you still get a curfew, for example, and things like that? It would seem sort of inappropriate, right? And so perhaps home is something that you carry with you as a human. In any case, each of the 18 chapters receives a name from Homer's Odyssey, which was later added. Telemachus, Nestor, Proteus. For example, this is why certain editions of Ulysses do not have the chapter headings and are hard to, it is hard to find out which chapter you are actually in, because they take a more of an originalist convention with their editing. This is why I highly recommend the Gabler, because this is already a very difficult text without the appropriate road map. Stephen Daedalus is a teacher and would-be writer whose mother has just died. He spends his day working in thought and later drinking and getting into debauchery. He lives in the Martello Tower, which is itself described as the Omphalos, the middle tower. It was Britain, or excuse me, that was built by the British during a conflict with the French. And so he himself, as sort of a symbol of Irish art, attempting to transcend the British English influence on him through his language and his political status and his culture, as well as the Roman Catholic master, the Latin master, the Roman master, the Italian master that he has. Even the place that he lives is itself a representation of the colonization of his people by another people. The Martello Tower existed as a fort for the English against the French to defend their land, Ireland, Dublin, against the French. And so Leopold Bloom, he goes out to acquire food for his breakfast, actually a pork kidney, which if you may know, if you know Jewish dietary restrictions, is very much not kosher. You are not allowed, if you are Orthodox Jewish, to eat anything with a cloven hoof. Something with a cloven hoof, not horses don't have that, but goats and pigs. Anybody a farmer? Anybody know about hooves and things like that? It's so funny. I saw a video of a hoof being cleaned the other day, and I looked at the comments, and all these people were like, "I live in a city and have never seen a farm, but I can't stop watching this." It's so funny how many city people. In any case, he makes breakfast for Molly. Notice that gender inversion there. Not her making it for him making it for her. And so also she's the one who goes out like Odysseus, and Odysseus cheats on his wife multiple times during the course of the Odyssey with various goddesses, Circe and Calypso, and has a little tete-a-tete with a beautiful young lass named Nausicaa. But this figure of Odysseus himself gets cheated on, makes dinner or breakfast in bed for his wife. He is not this Greek classical figure of this macho man who is served by ladies. Absolutely not Leopold Bloom. So how is he a figure of Odysseus, being so different? He's a different sort of man from him. Odysseus is known for being cunning and strategic, but he's also an excellent wrestler, an excellent thrower. The guy is, there are better terms, but I'll just put it parochially, he's diesel. He's known for being a thinker. He's really highly masculine, very much a Greek hero. The Greeks were very much impressed by the body. This is why sculpture achieves such heights there. And in fact, Friedrich Nietzsche says of them, an argument against one's words was one's looks as a Greek. So the more beautiful one was physically, the more one had to say. And I think that is actually a convention some people still maintain. We do have an effect, if you look in psychology, called the halo effect, where if somebody is very good looking, you tend to think that they are noble and good as well, which is sort of interesting. You can get past that, of course. Okay, but Leopold Bloom, strange figure of this great hero. He later attends a funeral, a bar, the library, and multiple bars, the library, and pulls Stephen out of trouble in a place called Night. You go for night to have nighttime. I think Sin City, if you ever saw the Frank Miller adaptation of the movie, the name of the area where the prostitutes are, not the red light district, but I think it is called something like Nighttown. In any case, Molly Bloom. We don't get her perspective at the beginning of notes. Chapter 16 nor 17. We only get it in 18. So it is reserved for the final perspective. And she gets the least amount of time and space to express her perspective, but it is totally hers, because it is only her that speaks, and she speaks last of any character in the text. And so perhaps this is meaningful to you. She will eat breakfast provided by Leopold, and then will cheat on him in the afternoon with her manager. She's a singer, blazes boiling. Evidence of their tete-a-tete, that means head-to-head, by the way. So it's a conversation as a tete-a-tete. Just something you should also know, mano a mano doesn't mean man-to-man, it means hand-to-hand. So hand-to-hand combat will be evident when, and that's Spanish, by the way, evident when Bloom returns to bed later in the book. As I told you, they'll find a lot, space where blazes bend, as well as the crumbs, as well as some additional vulgar details that are the result of some concupiscence having happened earlier. There are physical reminders of the act of copulation in the bed that have not been cleaned, that Molly has ostensibly left for Leopold Bloom to see. And we might really want to think about why. She doesn't seem to be ashamed of what she has done. She doesn't seem to be hiding what she's done. She seems to see what she has done differently from Bloom. And so perhaps that is the ultimate difficulty, right? Sharing perspectives between husband and wife. In fact, in the Odyssey, there is a word for this. It's a Greek word. It's homophronesis. So homo, we know, means same. In Greek, remember it's Latin, where homo means human. It's funny. Phronesis means like thinking or thought. So to be of one mind. You might also see the difference in perspective between Bloom and Stephen as the ultimate difference in perspective between one generation and another, between me and you. I am now in this institution attempting to enlighten you, and you are all like, I don't know about the value of the things you have to say. You say these things, you say in time, I'll understand this. But you may be some old fool. And that may be true, and that may be true. But it is that perspective that I have to supervene to reach you, to give you something of value that I have spent my, the time since my youth attempting to acquire. And so now I return from the woods, I'm covered in dirt and moss and things like that. I look kind of funny to you, but what I've brought is not just the dirt and the moss that mars my visage, but also the knowledge of what's in the woods. So will Bloom be able to reach a similar perspective, the same perspective as wife? Will he be able to reach this figure of his son as well? The answer is unclear, just as it is in any life. Will a father reach a son? Will the wife and the husband attain a mutual perspective and maintain their relationship, or will they fail to? And will their relationship break? This is not only the crux of this text, but this may be the crux of a human life. How to maintain one's dearest relationships and the troubles that come up during just ordinary days that threaten to destroy it. Perhaps some of you have had a very interesting semester. Have any of you ever lost a friend? Sure. Okay. And you don't need to say this. What about a boyfriend or a girlfriend? Oh, paramour. Sometimes you don't see these things coming. Often you don't see these coming until you change your focus. Like you say, I didn't see this coming. Someone's like, well, that's because you weren't looking. Because A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, P happened if you didn't see any of it. Which means you weren't looking. Which means you don't care. And so this is in some ways just a day, in some ways a day of days where things come to climax. Not to be vulgar, but this is where things come to a head, where the thing that has been building finally happens. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick picture. Tell me if you can get it. This is a really bad picture, by the way. Okay, I got to give, these are humps, by the way. And I'm putting things on its back. Its back broke. What is that an expression of? Camel, straw that broke the camel's back. It was the last straw, as we say. Okay, very good. I've said a lot of this before, but I need to say it again. Ulysses is the Latin or Roman name for Odysseus. That may confuse you a little or annoy you. The Romans spoke Latin, just as Americans speak English. So the Roman language was Latin because of the people who were native to the region near Rome came from a place called Latium or Latium, and were the Latin peoples. Each chapter receives a name from Homer's Odyssey. Most chapters include a running theme related to Homer's Odyssey. For example, the second chapter is called Nestor. Nestor in the Odyssey is described by the epithet the Gorinean horseman. Gorinean horseman. He's a horseman. We get it in Homer. And there are references to horses all over chapter 2. In fact, on the wall behind Mr. Deasy are pictures of famous racehorses. And so James Joyce is playing with us a little bit. He knows that this is the Nestor chapter. He knows that we as readers of the Odyssey know that Nestor is himself a wise old man who is known for being a horseman. And so we have this sort of farcical wise man, right? Mr. Deasy is not very smart. He tries to debate with Stephen. Stephen's way smarter than he is, doesn't even want to debate with him. And then he speaks in platitudes, right? We never let them in. That's what he says of the Jews at the end of it. He's also, there are other things that make him appropriate to Stephen too, because he is also somebody who believes in British home rule. Which to someone like Stephen, who is he considers history a nightmare from which he must awake because of the influence of the British and the Roman Catholics on him. This Mr. Deasy is what Stephen would consider totally a stooge for a way of thinking that Stephen thinks is out of date and out of touch. And so not this brilliant, extremely wise figure like actual Nestor, but a much more ironic representation of Nestor in Ireland. Oh yes, interesting. We get epithets that are themselves rips on Homer's own. Buck Mulligan describes the snot green sea. The Greek epithet is the wine dark sea, is how it's often translated, though I think if you've seen the sea before, snot green is probably a better description than wine dark, right? Like, is the sea purple or is it like greenish? Except for in those beautiful spots where it's actually blue. Yes, well, we get another one like that too, but I am forgetting exactly what it is all over. All right, let's go very quickly through the first 3 chapters. Chapter 1, Telemachus and the Black Mass. Telemachus is the 21 or so year old son of Odysseus. Odysseus has been gone for 20 years. So Telemachus is like a figure who has grown up without a father. He is a figure that has grown up with a father, though his father is ostensibly still alive. Telemachus hangs around his house in Ithaca, daily watching his mother Penelope's suitors eat his food and sleep in the starving room. He did this for 3 straight years or so. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, visits him, sends him to Nestor, the wisest of the Achaeans, and Menelaus, who was himself one of the highest ranking of the Achaeans and was a brother to the commander-in-chief of the Achaeans at the war in Troy, named Agamemnon. Agamemnon has now died. He was murdered by his wife when he returned home by Nestor because he had sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia without her knowledge, and she held that against him. Additional things to say about that as well. Menelaus was also the one from whom Helen was stolen by Paris of Troy, which caused the Trojan War. So Telemachus leaves home to visit a wise man, a man who has endured in some ways more than any, at least in the context of that story. To Stephen, he lives on the Martellus Tower on the seashore near Dublin. He has breakfast together before joining Buck Mulligan on a walk to his morning swim. Something about Buck Mulligan. Buck Mulligan seems like the hero of this story. He is brash, he is brazen, he is funny. He tells the ballad of joking Jesus. Did any of you notice that one? It's a very irreverent story. He says, part of it is, I'm the queerest old fellow that you've ever heard. My mother's a Jew, my father's a bird. Do any of you understand the joke that's being made there? My mother's a Jew, Mary. My father's a bird. Who is the father of Jesus, according to this joking ballad of joking Jesus? The Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is represented by a dove, often by a bird. So my father's a bird. Sort of fun. And so he's a deeply irreverent individual, but Buck Mulligan is a medalist. He's a little bit older than Stephen. He's tall and handsome, like Blazes Boylan. He has also recently saved somebody from drowning. He is a hero. Stephen is afraid of the water, and he thinks about it. He thinks about, could he even, if he saw a man drown, would he even try to save him? He thinks, probably not. And so he doesn't seem super heroic compared to Buck Mulligan. And during the course of his day, he will not be treated as if he is heroic compared to Buck Mulligan. Everybody at Buck Bloom and the father of Stephen seems to think that Buck carries the weight of the future of Ireland on his shoulders, whereas in reality, it is far more likely that Stephen does, unprepossessing Stephen. The chapter ends with Stephen saying, usurper, it's the final word of the chapter, after handing away the key to the tower. Buck Mulligan starts the text with he institutes a Latin Mass, introigo ad altare Dei, which means I will come to the altar of God. Let's see, there's also an additional figure who is an interloper in this Martello Tower, an Englishman named Haynes, who means to make a book of the sayings of Stephen. Note that Stephen wants to himself be a writer. He wants to write the uncreated conscience of his people, but to take his thoughts and to anthologize them, or to suggest that he is part of a people that is no longer truly moving through time and living, right? More like it is an attempt to put his thoughts in something more like a museum, to represent him as something to represent him as a representation of time gone by. Haynes is a figure of the colonizer, the English colonizer, and treating Stephen as a curiosity rather than as truly a creative intellect. He also has a really strange dream the night before we meet him of hunting a black panther and is screaming all night and terrifies Stephen. Stephen seems to think that this man might try to kill him. And then Stephen Daedalus, he's called Kench by Buck Mulligan. Buck Mulligan says that because Kench means blade. Keep in mind that his mother died the year before, and he has returned from Paris, French speaker, Italian speaker, knows Latin, not much Greek, and of course English, doesn't know Irish. Was a gifted young student and a portrait of the artist as a young man. Trying to get voice to the soul of Ireland, difficult thing to do. And the nature of the Irish, it was interesting, the oppressive English pains and the weight of the past all oppress him. So yes, in the first chapter, there is a character who shows up who is a milkmaid and brings the milk for the toast for the breakfast of the individuals. It's so funny. The milkman was something that my parents grew up having, but the milkman, we don't have an idea about somebody bringing us milk every day these days. She is an old Irish woman. Haynes, the Englishman, knows Irish because he learned it at university to study it. Not to truly engage in culture, tries to speak to the old woman in Irish. She says, "What is that? French?" She doesn't speak Irish. Is he truly trying to understand the people in Ireland? Or does he have some idea about what it means to be Irish? And so he's trying to take the quotes of one of their bards, taking the language that they once spoke, that they no longer speak, and he is forming an image of the Irish that is perhaps not true to what they actually are. In any case, in some ways, the first chapter is sort of bland. There's a breakfast, there's some talk between each other. We hear that Buck Mulligan's aunt does not want him to go anywhere near Stephen because she claims he killed his own mother, though he really just didn't honor her final wish. A little bit different there, I would say. And then Buck goes for a swim. His two companions refuse to. Haynes smokes a cigarette, and Stephen's afraid of the water, so he doesn't take his monthly bath. He's apparently very unclean, and he goes off to work. At work, in the small town of Dalkey, something like 7 miles away from Dublin, he's teaching history. He teaches the history of a Greek conflict. In fact, one that was led by Pyrrhus, from which we get a very famous expression, so-called Pyrrhic victory. It's a tough word to spell, Pyrrhic. Pyrrhic victory is an expression that we have in our own language for when you win a battle, the cost was so high that you really lost. And so you win, congratulations, is the feeling of a Pyrrhic victory. It's like winning an argument with your spouse, but then you get divorced. Okay, you won, but you really lost in winning. And this is what he's talking about with the students. And he asks a student a question. The student sort of looks up at him and doesn't know the answer and makes a joke, and the other boys laugh. Adam is an all-boys school, by the way. It's a very archetypal situation. It's half day. He only teaches till 10. And all the boys run out at the end of his lesson in order to play hockey. One stays behind, a weak student who needs to work on his numbers, named Cyril Sargent. In Cyril Sargent and his weak eyes, Stephen sees a figure of himself, and he thinks, even though he's obviously way more intelligent than Cyril Sargent, he thinks, a face only a mother could love. I wonder if my mother felt that way about me. She loved me. And what's he thinking about again? Even though he's just teaching and talking to the student about math, all of a sudden what has come back to his head? He carries his mother, the death of his mother. She brought up in the first chapter. He sees it in the second chapter. Start to see how I think a human sees things on our minds, things in our memories. We see them in the world in which we live. In any case, Mr. Deasy asks Stephen to take an article to 2 papers for him, the 2 local Dublin papers. We will see those in chapter 7. And now on hoof and mouth disease. What is hoof and mouth disease? An affliction of horses. It would actually happen a little bit after 1904. I think it's 1912 when it broke out, but there's a little bit of anachronism in this text. In any case, we will start with chapter 3. Next time, Proteus in the Shifting Sands. I appreciate you all being here. Looking forward to reading your essays, and I hope that you have